Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, today I thought that I would do a little video on Demetrius Andrade. And the reason why I wanted to do a video on Demetrius Andrade is because there's always a decent amount of people that allege that Demetrius Andrade is debatably the most avoided fighter today in boxing, or has been the most avoided fighter in all of boxing for the past several years. I've been hearing about Demetrius Andrade for the past several years, and when I take a look at his resume, I can't necessarily say that even the majority of the time he's fought B class fighters. And a certain amount of people, of course, are going to say, well, that's not necessarily his fault. Everyone ducks him, everyone avoids him, blah, 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 all sort of stuff. Well, you know what? Bottom line is this: when I take a look at it, usually usually when you have a fighter that says that everyone is avoiding them and that fighter can't even seem to get one A class fight, usually it's because they're not trying to get a lot of those A class fights. Now, to be fair to Demetrius Andrade, I do believe that he has tried to get a couple of A class fights, and overall, it has not come to fruition. He at one point in time tried to get that Billy Joe Saunders fight. Billy Joe Saunders was caught on steroids, so that fight ended up being canceled. I believe that he called out Jamal Charlo. Jamal Charlo, he, wanted Jamal Charlo to sign with DAZN. And really, in my opinion, that would have been a good move for Jamal Charlo anyway, because that's where basically all the big boy middleweights are at. Now, for some of the super middleweights, some of the PBC, they have some of the better super middleweights. But Jamal Charlo recently said that he doesn't even plan on moving up. So why not try to go over to DAZN, where you have Gennady Golovkin, who's the IBF champion, I believe, and you have Demetrius Andrade, who I believe is a WBO middleweight champion right now. Jamal Charlo, in my opinion, does not want either one of those fights, but it is what it is. But when it comes down to it, man, when it comes down to Demetrius Andrade, I do believe that there are certain fights that he has, tried to get overall that, certain fighters just don't want to face him. And I get that. Am I saying that Demetrius Andrade is not avoided? I think he's avoided by a certain amount of people. And the biggest allegation that a certain amount of the Demetrius Andrade fans love to say is that Canelo Alvarez has been avoiding Demetrius Andrade for a certain amount of years. Now, I'm going to say this about Demetrius Andrade, and a certain amount of people, of course, are not going to agree with it. I had a disagreement with a certain amount of the Joseph Parker fan base and with the Demetrius Andrade fan base in my recent fight predictions with their upcoming fights. One with Demetrius Andrade happening this week, this Saturday, and another one with Joseph Parker happening on May 1st. And a big part of the reason why a certain amount of people disputed my prediction videos is because they thought I was wrong about Joseph Parker and Demetrius Andrade's skill set, or at least the way that I thought about them. Now, in my opinion, I do think that they're both A-class fighters for their divisions. But I think when you take a look at a lot of people and the way that they rank them, in my opinion, they've actually been a little bit overrated. And a certain amount of people, of course, are not going to agree with that, especially the Joseph Parker one. That's okay. It is what it is. In my opinion, both of those fighters in their career have actually been a little bit disappointing with overall the amount of hype that I have heard about them or behind them. And a certain amount of people are not going to agree with that. But when I take a look at Demetrius Andrade, when it comes to the talent that I've always heard about this dude allegedly having, I think he is a very talented boxer. I think that he's pretty much in that same class with Jamal Charlo, Danny Jacobs, Billy Joe Saunders, David Benavidez, and Caleb Plant. All those fighters are kind of in that same league, and then I think Canelo is a league above them. But when it comes to Callum Smith, in my opinion, you can debate Callum Smith in that little, debate as well. All those fighters are kind of in that same area. And when it comes down to it, the problem is with Demetrius Andrade, man, is that this man has no A-class fights on his resume. I mean, literally none. And a certain amount of people overall can say that, well, Demetrius Andrade is the boogeyman and all this other stuff. Listen, dude, bottom line is this. How do you not have one A-class fight on your resume? Not one? Guillermo Rigondeaux, in my opinion, in the lower weight classes, and if you were watching boxing about 5 years ago, before Guillermo Rigondeaux fought Vasyl Lomachenko, Guillermo Rigondeaux was avoided by everybody. I mean, literally, no one wanted to fight that dude. Leo Santa Cruz didn't want to fight him. Carl Frampton didn't want to fight him. Scott Quigg didn't want to fight him. All those guys didn't want to fight him. But even Guillermo Rigondeaux, at one point in time in his career, was able to get a Nonito Donaire, who at that point in time was an A-class fighter. Then even a little bit later on, he was able to get a Vasil Lomachenko. My point being is this, even if you are somewhat heavily avoided in boxing, you're going to usually get one of those big fights sooner or later. Araceli Lara, who is another Cuban fighter who, in my opinion, was a very heavily avoided fighter at the 154-pound division. You know who actually avoided an Araceli Lara fight? And a lot of people don't bring this up, Demetrius Andrade. A certain amount of people don't bring this up. Demetrius Andrade several years ago was calling out Araceli Lara, but then when Lara actually called him out on his bluff, Demetrius Andrade wasn't serious about it. And Demetrius Andrade basically was exposed for being all talk and no action. But you're not going to hear new media in the LDBC report on that. My bottom line is this. There is some fault on Demetrius Andrade to why he's not getting these big fights. And if he does truly believe that some of these big, name fighters aren't fighting him and that they're going to avoid him, in my opinion, you got to try to trap him in a corner. And I think a great place to start, because I believe this fighter also fights on DAZN. I could be wrong about that, but correct me. Chris Eubank Jr., I think actually is a very decent fight to try and start off with. Chris Eubank Jr. is not necessarily an A-class fighter, and he's not the biggest household name, but he's somewhat of a name that's going to put you out there, and he certainly is a solid B-class fighter. That's a fighter that's fought George Groves, he's fought Billy Joe Saunders, he's fought Matt Korobov, he's fought a certain amount of fighters. He's at least a solid B-class fighter. I would love to see Demetrius Andrade face a fighter like that. Once again, and let me just talk about Demetrius Andrade's talent real quick. I think that he can be a very talented fighter. When I've seen him in certain fights, I think that he is an A-class fighter. Listen, what I've said is this, but when I do see him in a certain amount of fights, in a couple of fights that I've seen him in, I don't think that he's on the level that a certain amount of his fan base has tried to allege that he's on. And of course, a certain amount of his fan base got offended by that. I had this one dude, you just don't like Demetrius Andrade. What are you talking about? But Canelo Alvarez, he'll fight Liam Smith and he'll fight all these guys, but Demetrius Andrade doesn't deserve a title shot. That's not what I'm saying. I do believe that Demetrius Andrade would be more deserving of a title shot than, say, an Ildrim or Liam Smith was back in the day when he got, his shot against Canelo Alvarez. That's not what I'm saying. Of course, he would be more deserving because I see Demetrius Andrade as a way more talented than fighters like that. But the bottom line is this, just to talk about his talent real quick, when I take a look at Demetrius Andrade, the majority in his fights, I think that he is a talented fighter. But I don't see this fighter that could potentially completely outbox Canelo Alvarez. Now, I don't know, maybe I just haven't watched all of his fights, I don't know. I've watched at least a few of them, I know that for sure. I've seen his fight against that one very tall African fighter that he fought a few years ago. That might have been the most impressive performance that I've seen out of Demetrius Andrade as of late. He looked very good in that fight. I think if that Demetrius Andrade shows up against Canelo Alvarez, I think maybe potentially he could give Canelo Alvarez a problem. But do I think that he would beat Canelo? Most likely not. Now, once again, that's not me saying that I would not want that fight to happen, because a certain amount of people are going to get that mixed up. But what I am saying is this. A certain amount of new media in the LDBC and Demetrius Andrade fans and Jamal Charlo fans, especially, certain people that are trying to push their propaganda, they can try to allege that Canelo Alvarez, he's weak, he's got no cojones, he's not facing Demetrius Andrade, he's not facing these fighters when it comes down to the overall, he's not facing these elite fighters. Well, here's the problem. And a certain amount of people may disagree with this. But first of all, even when I just take a look at the eye test, Demetrius Andrade is not outside of that group that I mentioned earlier, of that David Benavidez, Caleb Plant, Jamal Charlo, Billy Joe Saunders, Callum Smith, and, is there another fighter that I'm missing here? Danny Jacobs' pack. He's not really too far away out of that pack. Maybe you can argue that he's the most talented out of all of them, but if he is, it's not by much. You could also argue that he's the least talented of all of them. Now, personally, I would not say that. I'm not going to say that he's the least talented of all of them. I'm going to say that he would be more talented than a Danny Jacobs. You maybe could debate that he's more talented than a Jamal Charlo. But I would not say that he's maybe a David Benavidez as well. So he's somewhere in the middle of the pack for me. A Callum Smith, he probably would be more talented as well. So I would say that out of all the threats that could possibly haunt Canelo Alvarez, I would say Demetrius Andrade is right there. Maybe he's slightly above Charlo. Maybe he's slightly below Charlo. And a certain amount of people would disagree. Now, he might beat Charlo because of his style. But when I take a look at Demetrius Andrade, do I see someone that is just this A-plus skilled boxer? Not really. And a certain amount of people overall may disagree, but that's just what I see. But the problem is this. A certain amount of people want to spread this propaganda that, well, Canelo Alvarez doesn't want to face Demetrius Andrade, and that's the reason why he's not number one pound for pound on our list. Well, in my opinion, Demetrius Andrade, he's got to chase some bigger fights. I understand that apparently he's tried to chase the fights like with Jamal Charlo and a certain amount of these other guys. Listen, man, that's all well and good. But Demetrius Andrade, in my opinion, is not doing himself any favors by just fighting these guys that really aren't that well known. Liam Williams, he's fighting this weekend. Liam Williams, I think, when I took a look at a couple of his fights, because it was the first time that I heard of him, I think Liam Williams is a decent fighter. But no one is going to pat Demetrius Andrade on the back for defeating a Liam Williams. I mean, I'll give him a great amount of credit if he looks very good against Liam Williams, because I predict that Liam Williams might be able to give Demetrius Andrade some problems. But when it comes down to it, no one is going to say, wow, did you see that win that Demetrius Andrade had over Liam Williams? That's why, in my opinion, I think that he should start off by trying to chase a Chris Eubank Jr. fight. If you think that everyone is avoiding you, you have to start going after some sort of name. And Chris Eubank Jr., I think, would be a perfect fight. I believe he's at the middleweight division right now when it comes down to it. Demetrius Andrade says he wants to move up. But if you believe Canelo Alvarez is avoiding you, you got to kind of starting off with, smaller big names and then working your way up. Start off with Chris Eubank Jr., then maybe get a Danny Jacobs fight. Danny Jacobs, I believe, is also on the zone. Try to get, another one of these fights. And I'm sorry, but when I take a look at it, Demetrius Andrade, I don't think he's always trying to push for these fights. A certain amount of people may disagree. I understand that he's tried to push for a couple of other fights, but is he really serious about facing some of these bigger names if he's not pushing for some of the smaller big fights first? A certain amount of people may disagree. Now, once again, that's not me saying that Demetrius Andrade doesn't, deserve a Canelo Alvarez shot or doesn't deserve this type of shot. But I think when it comes down to it, what Demetrius Andrade has to do, he has to start off with the smaller names. Or a great move if he can possibly get this fight, if the PBC will work with the zone, which I think they could. Go up to 168 pounds and try to fight David Benavidez. David Benavidez is apparently a fighter that'll take on all comers. So I think that that's an interesting fight. But what Demetrius Andrade, in my opinion, kind of has to do, I would chase after Chris Eubank Jr. I would go after, I'm trying to think of another fighter that I just recently mentioned. Chris Eubank Jr. I think is a great place to start. Another fighter, God damn it, who did I just recently mention? I don't know, but if you went up to 168, maybe a Durrell brother, one of those guys. You gotta chase after some of these names. You gotta go after some of these names. No one is gonna pat you on the back for defeating a Liam Williams. No one's gonna pat you on the back for defeating a Selecki. Danny Jacobs, that'd be another great fight to try and make. Try to go after Danny Jacobs. I don't know if he's ever even tried to go after Danny Jacobs before. Now, maybe I'm wrong on that. One of you guys that can correct me if I'm wrong. But when it comes down to it, I need to see Demetrius Andrade in a big name fight. I need to see him in a big name fight because when you take a look at his resume, I've never seen this dude in the ring with an A-class fighter. Even Jamal Charlo and Billy Joe Saunders, who in my opinion don't necessarily have A-class resumes, even they have a better resume than Demetrius Andrade. So that's just the bottom line. Certain people can like it, they cannot like it. That's just the way that I see it. And once again, do I believe that sometimes Canelo Alvarez, does maneuver around these certain divisions? Do I believe that sometimes, he doesn't seem too interested in fighting Andrade, maybe because of his style? I think it's very possible. But if Demetrius Andrade wants that fight, he's going to have to trap him in a corner. He's going to have to start getting some of these names, man. He can't keep fighting these Liam Williams guys and, all these other, these Selecki guys and these no-name guys. He's not fighting anybody. And I know a certain amount of people want to say that he's being avoided, but is he really being avoided by everybody? You can't get a single fight with anybody? No names? You can't possibly get a fight with Chris Eubank Jr.? You can't possibly get a fight with Danny Jacobs? None of those guys? I'm not sure if I'm believing that. And the thing is that they want to try to criticize Canelo Alvarez for avoiding and ducking all these fighters, and we're not going to give him credit until he defeats Demetrius Andrade and Jamal Charlo. But the bottom line is this: Canelo Alvarez is facing fighters that are pretty much on the same level as a Demetrius Andrade or Jamal Charlo. And a certain amount of people may disagree. He fought Danny Jacobs not that long ago. He fought Gennady Golovkin not too long ago. Now, of course, Ildrim was not really that great of an opponent, but before he fought Ildrim, he fought Callum Smith. Callum, I know a lot of people like to shit on Callum Smith, but Callum Smith, dude, he was an A-grade fighter for that division. Callum Smith was the Ring Magazine champion. That means that by a good majority of people, and by Ring Magazine, you were looked at as the best fighter in that division. Not just one of the best, you were looked at as the best fighter in that division. That's what Callum Smith had. And when we even take a look at his credentials, Callum Smith has a win over George Groves. How come every other fighter besides Demetrius Andrade seems to get a decent fight under the belt, but Demetrius Andrade, he can't get one? He can't get one? Even Guillermo Rigondeaux in the lower weight divisions was able to get bigger fights than this dude, and he was heavily avoided. Araceli Lara, who's in the same division for years, he was even eventually able to get bigger fights than Demetrius Andrade in his career. I mean, shit, he's just got to fight somebody. He's got to fight somebody, and I know a lot of people want to blame everybody else, but the truth is that, to be honest with you, I think Demetrius Andrade could be trying to make better moves in other areas. I think going after Chris Eubank Jr., I think would be a fantastic idea. I think that's kind of where he needs to start, Get your name out there, a little bit more. Then maybe people would force you, or force Jamal Charlo, or Gennady Golovkin, or Canelo to eventually fight you. But right now, that's not going to happen because you're not fighting any of these names, man. You're not fighting any of these names. Take a look at the welterweight division right now. Jaron Boots Ennis is a new up-and-comer. There are already people calling for a Jaron Boots Ennis fight to fight Terrence Crawford or Errol Spence Jr. Now, a certain amount of people might say that there's a racial element to it. There might be a little bit, but when it comes down to it, bottom line is this. Demetrius Andrade, he just has to get these big fights. That's the bottom line. All right? So you got to start facing these big names. That's the bottom line. And Canelo Alvarez, man, once again, he's fighting Billy Joe Saunders next. Billy Joe Saunders, when you take a look at his credentials, he's pretty much on the same level as Jamal Charlo. He's pretty much on that same level as Demetrius Andrade. So these guys, they can say, oh, they want to. Well, Canelo Alvarez, he's avoiding these fighters. Canelo is fighting high-level fighters. Besides Ildrim, as of recent, he's fought high-level fighters for the past few years. A certain amount of people, they're not going to want to admit that. Danny Jacobs is an A-class fighter. Gennady Golovkin was an A-class fighter. He was a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter. Sergey Kovalev probably would have been top 20 pound-for-pound at the time. Was he the same Crusher Kovalev that fought Andre Ward? No, of course not. But he was still a very decent fighter. And a lot of people, including myself, looked at that as more of a threat than a Demetrius Andrade. Because Demetrius Andrade ain't fighting anybody. He's not fighting anybody. And that's the problem. All right, it is what it is. You have to try and chase some of the names, even if it's a Chris Eubank Jr., like I said, somebody, but fighting Liam Williams and all these guys, like, you're not gonna attract big attention by fighting these names. People look at Demetrius Andrade right now like he's fighting taxi drivers, because that's pretty much what he's doing. It is what it is, but I don't know, man. We'll see what happens. That's just my opinion on the situation. It's just frustrating to watch because the Demetrius Andrade fan base, they've been elected for so many years that this man is the boogeyman and that everyone is avoiding him. You can't get one fight. Even Jamal Charlo in his last fight, he fought Dervyachenko. I believe that was his last fight. Demetrius Andrade has not even had a fighter on his resume like a Dervyachenko. That's how bad his resume is. You can't tell me that everyone in the world is avoiding you. Not everybody. There's certain fighters that have losses out there that aren't afraid to face certain fighters. You tell me that Dervyachenko and overall, Chris Eubank Jr., that they'd be completely afraid to face you? Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they would be. But I just can't see that. I'm sorry. You have to face some of these names that some of these other big names have fought. Jamal Charlo, even though I don't think he's making the 100% correct moves, at least facing a Dervyachenko was somewhat in the right direction because Gennady Golovkin someone fought him recently, so maybe there'd be more pressure on Golovkin to take that fight. But Demetrius Andrade, man, he's not fighting anybody. And that's the bottom line. And Canelo Alvarez, when you take a look at him, bottom line is this. When you take a look at him for the past 3 years, he's fought Golovkin, who is an A-class fighter. He's fought Callum Smith, who is an A-class fighter. And he's going to fight Billy Joe Saunders, who's an A-class fighter. Ildrim, of course, was a C-class fighter when it comes down to it. And he fought Sergey Kovalev, who even saw at the time was an A-class fighter. You can say all you want to that Canelo Alvarez is avoiding these guys and he's cherry-picking. You know, Canelo is taking tough fights, man. He's taking tough fights. He's taking fights that a lot of people look at as more challenging than Demetrius Andrade or a Charlo. So if they really want that Canelo Alvarez fight, and once again, that's not me saying that I still don't want to see those fights. Of course I do. But if you believe that Canelo Alvarez is avoiding you, you have to trap him in a corner. You have to start facing some of these big names. Jamal Charlo, the right direction for him would be to move up to 168, face David Benavidez like he said he would, because there's a lot of attention on Canelo Alvarez to possibly face those guys. Demetrius Andrade, if he believes that a certain amount of people are avoiding him, and I do believe a certain amount of people are avoiding him, he has to start off small. A certain amount of people, once again, they're not going to like this video, but that's just my opinion on the situation. I need to see Demetrius Andrade at least push for a Chris Eubank Jr. Something, because once again, he's just not fighting anybody. But that's just my opinion on this situation. Let me know what you guys think. That's pretty much my opinions on this. That's pretty much all I have to say. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.